Hello, I want to welcome Beth Allison Barr. She is a history professor at Baylor and has recently written a book that is launching around the same time as Pray Tell that I was so eager to share with all of you because I know that there's some major crossover on what we're talking about and how the issue of silencing women historically by the church and mainstream culture is something that she knows a lot about. So I am so excited to introduce to you this historian, this professor, someone who has so much to share on the matter. Beth, thank you for joining me, Beth.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the crossover here.
Yes, so The Making of Biblical Womanhood is coming out in April, and I kind of like to say that this book really is my whole life. I grew up in a conservative evangelical world, although my family wasn't especially conservative. My parents were both from a different backgrounds, but we ended up in a small town in Texas. And so I grew up in the late 80s and 90s when sort of this conservative evangelicalism was really coming to its high point.
Yeah.
And so my life kind of evolved at the same time that we see, Wayne Grudem's systematic theology and John Piper and Wayne Grudem's recovering biblical manhood and womanhood. And James Dobson was in his heyday.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, he was a constant voice in my world when I was growing up. And so this framed, I think, sort of my background. And then, of course, I ended up going to Baylor University, which is a Baptist university. I married a Southern Baptist pastor. And then I headed off to Chapel Hill to do my PhD in medieval women's history
Oh,
and talk about a culture clash.
yeah.
And so The Making of Biblical Womanhood brings together this story of my life with what I have learned as a historian. And I'm somebody who remains faithful to the Christian. I'm still a Baptist. I'm still strong. Faith is at the core of all that I am. And my experience as a historian has really brought me to realize that the patriarchy that we see in the church just isn't Christian. It comes from the non-Christian influences of the historical world around us. So that's pretty much it. I'll talk a little bit more, but that's the background to The Making of Biblical Womanhood.
Yeah, as I was researching why we silence women historically in the church, in business and education and politics,
Yeah.
um, there's always some faulty ideology at the base of why we silence women and why we treat women the way they do. So, could you give us a little bit of context about how we historically have viewed women as second in the church?
Yeah. No, well, in the church, you're in history as a whole. Um, in the church, indeed, we have, sort of uh, part of what I do in The Making of Biblical Womanhood is, and I'm not the first historian to do this, this is actually very well established, is we know very early on in the Christian tradition that ancient Greek and Roman ideas about how women's bodies are inferior and that women are actually deformed men. And that they're intelligent, that's Aristotle for you, women are deformed men, and that our brains are not quite as well developed as men's, and so we are intellectually inferior. And this is a classical idea that crept into the church simply because of the world in which the early Christians
Yeah.
lived. And this is actually one of the things we see Paul doing. Paul actually keeps trying to beat back these pagan ideas about women and men, and his overall his overall teaching is that we are one in Christ, that we are in the body of Christ, that all of our voices matter, all of our work matters. But he's batting these very pervasive ideas that women are less than men. And so this crept into early Christian history, and it just really has continued. I mean, in fact, I think that's what this idea of patriarchy and this silencing of women is, this deeply grounded idea that women are less
Yeah.
than men are, and their voices are less authoritative and less valuable than those of men. So
Yeah.
does that help a little bit?
Yeah,
It's hard to,
absolutely. Absolutely. It's something that you realize has been baked in, right? So when we
yes.
look at today and we think of all that we are, uh, all that we believe about women, it is impossible to escape that Greco-Roman influence
Yeah.
that was present from the beginning. Absolutely. One of the things that I get most excited about, and I'm sure you do too, as you just briefly shared about Paul's instruction to the early church, but I get so excited when Jesus comes on the scene and you see this man who is so passionate about gendered equality and who is so passionate about women having a place in
Hmm.
society and in the church that he even uh, delivers the news of his resurrection to a woman, and how
Right.
that was so profound in a day where a woman's testimony in court held no validity and it held no weight. So to see how uh, women have been elevated by men who understood their value. And
Yeah.
I'd love for you to explain, maybe even, has there been in history some men who really took it upon themselves to be allies and elevate women? As you've studied, I'm curious.
Oh yeah.
It's out.
No, no, exactly. And many of them actually were in the church. And so this is one of the things, one of the areas that that I argue. I'm a medieval historian, which is sort of interesting because often people who enter into this debate are biblical scholars, but I'm actually a medieval historian, and so I look backwards and I also look forwards, and so it provides a really interesting perspective, I think, for me. But one of the things that we see in medieval Christianity is this emphasis on the voices of women, and that Jesus always elevated the voices of women. And so this is actually something that the medieval church they couldn't ever silence women in the medieval church
Wow.
because they were so, they found the voices, the stories about Jesus, the stories about Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene in the medieval tradition was called the apostle to the apostles. And so that's actually the way she's referred to in medieval sermons. So by men who elevated women and emphasized, there's one, I can talk about men that people would know, but I can also talk about people whose names we don't know. Like, for example, there was a sermon author of a collection of sermons that we just know today as Middle English sermons. They were edited by the Early English Text Society. And the pastor who wrote this series, he says, there is no reason for men to shame or undervalue women because Jesus chose a woman to carry the news of his resurrection. And this is a very common theme that we see in medieval sermons where they say, okay, you might try to downplay the importance of women, but Jesus supported women. There's a famous 12th century man named Abelard, who I talk a little bit about in Making a Biblical Womanhood. He is a rather fascinating medieval story because he had a very torrid love affair with a nun. He was a monk, and he had a very torrid love affair with
Okay.
a woman named Eloise. Yes, a very torrid love
That
affair.
seems like it's going to be on HBO
Uh,
Max. You
it
just wait.
should.
You
That's
just
exactly
wait.
what I say in my book. I'm like, I don't know why this isn't an HBO movie yet,
Yeah.
but they have this torrid affair. Abelard, then her uncle finds out about it and he castrates Abelard, sneaks into his bedroom, sends men, and they actually attack Abelard and castrate him. He and Eloise end up in separate monasteries. Eloise gives birth to their child, who she names Astrolabe, which is also an interesting story. But so, I mean, this is fascinating thing, but Abelard actually supports the ordination of women,
Wow.
and he's one of the last sort of voices. And the reason he says women can do what men can do because women in the Bible did what men could do, and Jesus
Ooh.
elevated their voices. And I'm paraphrasing him, this is
Yes.
not word for word what he
I mean,
says,
I like
but
your way of doing it, Beth. I like.
that's essentially what he says. And so it's this, I think if we actually look at the historical narrative, what we find is that even though patriarchy is a continuity, that women are always silenced and devalued, at the same time there is a continuous thread of people who also are like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
this is not the way Jesus sees women.
Yeah.
And this is not the way women acted in the Bible. And so we also have this competing narrative
Mhm.
that shows that there is a long history of support for women and support for the value of women's words.
Oh, that's beautiful. So well said. In my situation, I found myself in a system that on paper valued women as equals, but in
Mhm.
practice did no such thing. And it was a Christian context. And I
Yep.
think for me, that dissonance and that rub really forced me to decide what do I believe about this. And when my own life was on the line, quite literally,
Yep.
my income and my place in my community was on the line, um, it was a reminder to believe in who Jesus says women are and what their words mean and the value of their testimony. And it also pushed me to stand up on behalf of other women, uh,
Yeah.
as in that situation, a very marginalized woman, to believe women.
Yeah.
And I think that this idea of believing women and believing their testimonies has been hijacked to say believe all women, and that's not really the call. It's saying where there is credible testimony, believe
Yeah.
women just like you would believe one single man. It
Yeah.
usually takes many women to speak up before they're heard, but often it only takes one man with influence, affluence, power to be believed. Can you speak to that of
Yeah.
hope
No.
for now of what we can do differently?
Yeah, no, and what you just spoke to, I mean, there's a long history of this too. In
Mhm.
the medieval world in court, it was multiple women were required to equal the testimony of one man.
Oh wow.
And so there's this idea that women's voices are not to be as trusted. I think, this stems from sort of these ideas about women being inferior. They also do stem from Christian ideas that focus on Eve,
Yeah.
and that it was the words of a woman that condemned us all, as some famous medieval Tertullian, famous medieval and ancient church fathers have said. The misogyny in the church is very much there, but I think it also has to do with the fact that in the way our modern culture and structure is built, it is built around structures that support the voices of men and our business world and our churches, and women simply aren't at the table. And I think this is really part of it, is that when you have an entire structure that's built where men are in charge, and where there is embedded within this an idea that women, simply because of who we are, simply because of our sex, that we cannot hold the same leadership roles of men, that makes men automatically devalue our voices.
Yeah.
So even though this complementarian claim that women are equally valid in the eyes of God, we just have separate roles. We know where this goes with racism.
Yeah.
What it does, though, it's still saying that if a man, simply because who he is, because of his body, can hold an authority position that women cannot, then it makes men less likely to listen to women's voices.
Right.
Christian patriarchy does not stay within the Christian household. It
Yeah.
bleeds over into all that we do.
Yeah.
So I think simply, in order for women's voices to be heard like men's, we've got to get women at those leadership tables.
Absolutely.
That's the only thing that's going to change this. And that's why, I mean, it's things like, I remember when I first started looking at Bible translations and looking at the people, and my gosh, no
Uh-oh.
wonder women's voices have been devalued in the Bible.
Wow.
And, notes have snuck in that say things like, oh, well, Phoebe can't be a deacon because she's a woman. So even though this word is deacon, she can't, it's clearly can't be applied to Phoebe. Um, there are no women at any of these tables.
Wow.
Who help translate? Just go look at the ESV. No one. There are not
No,
women.
I think the ESV is notoriously
They're not. And so
notoriously known
it's
to leave
like,
them out.
it seems to me, I always think about the woman of Canaan. She, in Matthew 15, she's one of my favorite stories. She was one of the most popular stories in medieval sermons about women.
Wow.
And that whole story is about disciples trying to silence this woman. But Jesus stops and hears her speak.
Yeah.
And the end of that story, he looks at her and he says, "Woman, you are of great faith."
Mm.
He never says that to any of the male disciples. He only says that to women in the Bible. He says, women, you are of great faith. Um, so I think that's
That's
something,
beautiful.
Jesus always hears women, and
Yeah.
he always lets their voices come through. So, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, that's
Yeah.
women's voices are not valued because women are not allowed at the table.
Yeah.
And men are taught that women can't be at the table. So therefore, why should they listen to women's voices?
Right. And I think, there's research done on, even if there's one woman in power, that will not ensure equality and
No,
fairness across the board or respect. It really has to be multiple women.
right.
Because as we know, if there's only one woman, then she's the token person. Well, we did the diversity thing, we've done the equality thing.
Exactly.
That doesn't mean she has power. She has a place, but not power. And I think
Right.
being able to understand that they go hand in hand is so
Mhm.
necessary for everyone to thrive, right? This isn't
Yes.
just for the advancement of women. This is for the advancement of all and society as a whole.
Oh,
So,
yeah. No,
it needs
exactly.
to really,
Women bring different perspectives, and they change the culture in a way that is beneficial to everyone when you get
yeah.
women.
Research also shows that if you were to put women in places of power, it would increase the GDP by, like, oh my goodness, I think almost 50% by the year
Yes.
2025. Men make less hasty decisions in power if there's more women on the board. Simple
Yes.
cities are designed. There's so much to show us that women, we deserve a place,
Women's voice.
and
Yeah, no, I'm totally on board with you. We see this. It changes the culture in a way that's good.
yeah,
So there's almost no reason. The only reason to keep women from the table are these enduring constructs of patriarchy and misogyny.
yeah. I think as a woman of color, I've really internalized that there's men, obviously white men, and I grew up in a very rural town out in the middle of nowhere in Washington State. I didn't meet another person of color till I was 12, Beth. Till I was 12 years old. I'm Indian, and I'm adopted. My parents are white. My brothers are white.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's, white males, and then there's women, white women, and then there's women of color. So even how the patriarchy has ordered everyone on this,
Yes.
on this ladder that feels impossible to rise above it. Now, when I think about your knowledge of medieval times, I think of how many women in history were doing the thing that we don't know of because they
We
didn't get
don't.
to tell their story. They didn't control the narrative of that
Exactly.
time. And I'm just
Yes.
eager to know, and especially when we're with the Lord face to face, to see just these incredible women. Now in modern history, we have more stories, but I think of earlier times that I'm like, I bet there was just so many women who were making such incredible advancements that we today can stand on their shoulders because of their sacrifice. So do you have any that come
Yes.
to mind?
No, well, yeah, I mean, obviously the ones that we do know about, one of the most famous ones, who at least is famous in for medieval historians, is Christine de Pizan. Have you heard of Christine de Pizan?
No, tell me.
Okay,
Tell
so
me.
Christine de Pizan, she was from Italy, but her father moved to France and was actually at the French court and was employed by the French court. And Christine de Pizan grew up in the French court. She married a French nobleman, but he died when she was in her 20s, left her with 3 small children and her mother to support. And so Christine de Pizan, she'd been educated very well by her father, and so she started writing for a living. She became really one of the first professional writers, and she became the court writer for France, for the French royalty.
Wow.
And she also became one of the first vocal or not one of the first, but her writings endure. She got really angry about this medieval romance that everybody was reading. I sort of, when I talk about it in class, I compare it to 50 Shades of Grey. Sort of, it's like this thing that it's really horrible for women, but everybody's like reading it under the table and like passing. It's a dirty romance. And she gets really angry about this one. It's called The Romance of the Rose. And so she begins writing a series of letters where she argues against this type of literature, says this is bad for women, that this creates these misogynist ideas, and it actually leads to abuse against women. And then she writes a book called The City of Ladies, in which she says, okay, all these men say women are good for nothing and that we aren't valuable. She goes through history and she pulls up all of the valuable women, including biblical women, who have done something significant. And she says, you tell me, men, that women haven't been important in constructing our world. And so she writes this defense of women called The City of Ladies. It's really this amazing thing. And she, and she has many, many times where she stops and she says, essentially what she says is, she says, the reason we don't know is because women aren't included.
Right.
So she says, what we've got to include women. So she writes this book to include women and to tell men why their ideas about women are wrong. And it's really incredible. And she's not the first woman to do this. I mean, if we look throughout history, women step up and they say, hey, y'all, we are not alone.
Yeah.
We have always been here. We have always made significant contributions. It's just that our voices don't get included.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're saying today, is that Christian history looks really, really different when you include women.
Yes. Wow. Oh, so well said. And as we're writing history today, I think it is just more vital than ever that we all speak up, even if our life isn't on the line, if we're not in the hot seat. I think one of the things Pray Tell really explores is this idea of what's the role of the bystander. I found myself in a position where I was harassed by somebody who should not have been harassing me.
Yes.
Well, that's probably as much detail as I'm legally allowed to give. But when push came to shove, he took advantage of people I cared for in this system that I found myself in. And, you say to yourself, well, this didn't happen to me. Do I need to do anything about this? Is this my job to speak up? And I think especially in a Christian context, we're like, oh, don't be a gossip. Don't go talking about other people, versus no, I'm a truth teller and I can stand up as an advocate on behalf of this person. So I think hearing that story of did you say City of Ladies, right?
Yeah, City of Ladies.
Yeah,
you should go read it.
I'm good. Are you kidding me? After that, you pitched it well. But this idea that there is power in numbers, this idea that there is power in our collective whole, is never to be underestimated. It's never to be underestimated, of its power and of its ability to move toward justice.
No, I think that's right. And we're probably close to being out of time here, but really fast, I don't know if you know much about my story, but that's exactly how I ended up with Making a Biblical Womanhood. Is my husband got fired for standing up for women in the church. And so that was actually the core of some of what, where I was like, I'm done. I've had enough. We've got to tell the truth.
Yeah.
I think about Rachel Held Evans. That's what she had. She said, tell the truth. We tell the truth. As historians, we tell the truth. And I think
it's unpopular.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too, one of my favorite historians, she is at the University of Michigan, and her name is Catherine French, and she has this really powerful book. Evangelical women don't read historians like this, but she has this book called The Good Women of the Parish. And in it, it's about women in the very late medieval church. And in it, she talks about how women, through these parish communities that were outside of their family structures, that women actually became these powerful agents within this mostly male-dominated church. And then she has this fantastic epilogue where she talks about, the Reformation did a lot of good things for women, but we lost these female only communities with the Reformation, that because women moved into the household, their primary place became the household, which isolated them from other women's communities. And she, essentially it's in these groups that women were able to make a difference. And so I think that's part of actually what I do in Making a Biblical Womanhood at the end, is maybe similar to what you do, is it's a call for women to stand together. We've got to stand together. And because that's how we can change the world. So.
Yeah. Beyonce said it, my persuasion can build a nation.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
Beth, thanks so much for joining me. It has been an
Sure.
absolute joy to share with you and learn more. And to find more about Beth and her book, you can look around this video and all the information will be there. Thank you.